for specific questions having to do with these first three messages. Sometimes there are a lot of questions. Sometimes we have certain people in the congregation that ask a lot of questions. So primarily, these first three messages are questions have arisen in your minds concerning these first three messages. But also, if you have burning questions, typically this point in the conference becomes a time where you can ask burning questions too, if you have other questions outside of the realm of what we have already discussed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Ali.
So you talked about loving our brothers and sisters in
Mm-hmm.
Christ. Can you address how we are to love unbelievers? We can't rejoice in the truth with
Right,
them
right.
because they're not acknowledging
Yeah.
the truth. So how do we go about that?
Well, I mean, I think we can do some of the same things that 1 Corinthians 13 describes in terms of bearing with people and not being haughty or rude, you know, that list of things. I think that should still govern our relationship with unbelievers. But there is a point at which you would say our love can't, what I can't do, it's unloving for me. Let me put it this way. It would be unloving for me to rejoice in evil with them. So that's where I think that verse 6 in 1 Corinthians 13 really helps us. Because what it tells us is this: I can love them in virtually all the ways listed there and display love to them. But if what they're asking me to do is rejoice in evil, that's not a loving thing to do. They'll tell me it is, of course, but it's not. And so I can't do that because I love them. So it's not a question of so much like drawing a line there. I can't love in rejoicing the truth because they won't let me. It would be unloving for me to rejoice in evil. That's how I would look at it. Now, you know, it's such a broad question. There are a million different kind of implications that you'd have to tease out, but that's to me has to be the general guideline. You look like you're about to say something. Okay. Let it ruminate. Yes.
I'm very new to all of this.
Yeah.
New believer.
Uh-huh.
And I have to say, first of all, it is an extraordinary time to learn to unlove the world.
Yes.
You know, everything going on. I have a lot of family that is, upset about, religious like festivals and
Sure.
birthdays and things that they've canceled, and find a lot of comfort in the idea of self-care and
Mm-hmm.
self-blessing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a huge way that people are comforting themselves right now. And I guess my question is, I don't know at what line you're supposed to take your self-care. Like, are you supposed to, I maybe point you towards things to
Yeah.
read about, like, at what level is it self-blessing versus
Right.
what you really need?
Right.
Like, the body is a temple.
Sure. Yeah. No. So I think there are kind of two ways I would divide that out. I don't have a good book recommendation off the top of my head, but two ways I would divide that out. One is there are things that go under that label of sort of self-care or self-care is probably the best term, that end up being selfish, that cut you off from other people, or put, the Philippians 2 tells us, it talks about the mind of Christ, and it says you need to look out not for your own interests only, but for the interests of others. So I think that's a line that we have to be really careful not to cross, which is, am I so preoccupied with my own interests that I'm ignoring the interests of others? If I am, then I really don't have the mind of Christ within me. So Philippians 2 for me would be a really good guide to thinking that through. But then there's another category that also goes under the label of self-care, which involves things like, get enough sleep at night and, to exercise and, to eat the right things that are healthy for you, those kinds of things. And I don't think there's anything wrong with those, because that's actually, I think, being a good steward of what God has given to us. And there may be occasions and seasons where you can't do that. You just can't get enough sleep. But I do think that in general, those are wise ways that we're supposed to behave and act. So the two sort of texts in my mind from the Bible, I don't have, a good book, but the two texts in my mind would be something like Philippians 2, or even some of these texts from 1 John that tell me, listen, I can't be consumed with my own interests at the exclusion of the interests of others. I've got to consider them more important than myself. But the other set of texts that I would look at would be things like the Proverbs, or even the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Proverbs enjoins us to live wisely, to work an appropriate amount, to save an appropriate amount. None of those things are wrong. In fact, those things are right, and you shouldn't not do them. And even a book like Ecclesiastes, which reminds us over and over again, amidst the brevity of life, that God has given us good things to enjoy. Frequently, the writer of Ecclesiastes will say, it's good for you to eat and drink and enjoy life with the family that God has given you. That's a good thing. And there are times the Ecclesiastes 3 talks about a time to mourn and a time to dance. So I think that kind of balance is going to help guide me. But again, it sort of depends what we mean by that term. But you're right, we live in a day and age where basically what goes under the label of self-care, which could be kind of a wisdom category, actually is just an excuse for me doing whatever I want at any moment because I'm the most important person in the universe. And so, I think we'd have to go through case by case to work through those things, but that's kind of how I would navigate it. Does that help a little bit? Okay. Yeah. It's a great question. Who? Oh, sorry.
How do you relate to other believers, specifically family members?
Yeah.
Whose definition of truth is different?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was told to do that, and I didn't so far. So the question was, how do you relate to other believers, even family members, whose definition of truth? Yeah. Now, can I ask a follow-up question just so I know how to address this? Do you mean that they don't believe there is such a thing as absolute truth, or do you mean they just understand the Bible differently than me? I think the words, the advice that comes into my mind most immediately is Paul's advice to Timothy. You correct people with great patience and careful instruction. Now, he's writing to Timothy as a pastor, and so our roles can be somewhat different. It may not be your role at every moment to correct people with great patience and careful instruction. But if you do correct them, it should be with great patience and careful instruction. I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the patience with which the Lord has dealt with us. If you think about the Lord as your teacher, how has He taught you? Well, boy, very patiently, very methodically. Sometimes you've had to learn the same lesson 1,000 times. No human teacher would ever do that. They would have, bailed on us long ago. But the Lord is very patient with us. So I do think that's the kind of attitude in teaching that we should have with one another. Now, there are. That's not to say that you just throw up your hands and say, well, you believe this, I believe that, it probably doesn't matter, or we can't know for sure. I wouldn't do that. That's not what I mean. But I do mean that in terms of method and in terms of in your own internal, forbearance, we need to be much more patient and gentle than we normally would be. Then again, I have classroom experience. I need to be, I need to remember how God teaches me, and so those are the guidelines that I would use. But I wouldn't. But again, that's not an excuse for compromise on those issues. And so you keep keep instructing them in the Scriptures. You keep modeling it. Oftentimes in situations like that, when people are won over, they're often won over because they see that not only is this a truth that is found on the pages of Scripture, but it's a truth that has had a transforming effect in your own life for the good. It's made you a more godly person. And so that sometimes can really weigh heavily in their thinking. Is that? Yeah, Ash.
So it's become a real issue with the whole pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
We all have our perspectives on how the virus affects people, but it certainly has had its effect on the church
Yeah.
as far as attendance, not only in the corporate worship, but also in things that are like Sunday school and so forth.
Yeah.
Some have a perspective that because they have to hold to the truth that they believe is justified, it's driven a wedge in the church between members and even caused significant problems in congregations. How do you approach that in terms of setting a priority on attendance in the meetings of the church, but at the same time considering your brothers as better and sisters as better than you?
Yeah. Well, so the question was about the current pandemic situation and different attitudes toward that and how we should handle those attitudes within the church, and how do you handle people who have different opinions? Do we always have to go with the opinion that's the most restrictive? And how do we manage the questions of unity in the church? It's a difficult one. I have been frankly a little shocked in talking to pastors. I mean, one of the things that I've started to do more of since I took on this current role at the seminary is I just call around to a lot of people. I'm just trying to get to know people. And so a lot of that has meant talking to pastors. And I am really shocked, and it's sad, at the number of congregations that are sort of torn apart by all of this. Because primarily, not because they couldn't come to some reasonable, middle ground or anything like that, but just because there are people sometimes on both sides that are extremely dogmatic, but then also critical of those who don't. That's really where it starts to have a sharper edge. So this has been an unexpected, in my mind, unexpectedly difficult season for many churches that I thought were very much at peace. And somehow this, of all things, has driven a wedge. So there are a couple issues that you mentioned. One is the priority and importance of public worship and of gathering together. There are people for whom the health risks are so significant that I would hope that their pastors and elders would say to them, listen, we're not trying to bind your conscience on this. I mean, you have these serious concerns, and we're going to do everything we can to try to help you because you're at great risk. I mean, this is an extreme example, but if someone was in the hospital, you wouldn't demand that they be there on Sunday morning. They're sick. And I think you could use some of the same logic with people who have certain conditions. So I want to say that leaders need to have that kind of sensitivity. At the same time, I don't think we can downplay the importance of public worship. It's found throughout the Scriptures. It's so significant to our lives. It's far more significant than I think even we recognize and know to our own lives and to the spiritual lives of other people. Remember what Hebrews says, consider how you may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not neglecting the gathering together. Well, that's just one aspect. When you don't gather together with other Christians, among other things, you're not able to spur them on toward love and good deeds. And then, of course, there's the fact that we're gathering in the presence of God to lift our voices in praise of Him, which we're commanded to do. So it's so significant that we gather together in the context of public worship. But I think really what the congregations, the leaders who I think I've seen handle this the best in churches have been ones who have said a couple things. They've said, we care about everybody here, and so please, we want to to be very sensitive to your health concerns if you have them. And so if for some reason that means you can't come, we want to respect that. But they've also said, so that's one thing they've said. The second thing they've said is this is vitally important for all of us, for our spiritual well-being and for our obedience to God. And then the third thing they've said, and I've heard, I know of churches that say this every single week, and I don't think that is overkill. Every single week they will say, we are aware that people in our congregation have very different perspectives on this. And that's going to lead to different behaviors, and we are determined as much as we can to listen to you and to honor one another and to defer to one another. Now, that hasn't led them to say, therefore we're not meeting, because some people think we shouldn't. But it has led them to repeatedly say, this has to be, we have to be people who honor one another, defer to one another, aren't quick to criticize one another. Now, I know that's sort of general, and that doesn't solve every problem, but I do think churches that have done that are acknowledging that there is a difference, because sometimes the divisiveness happens because there's a perception. There's a perception that, our elders don't even think about this. Or there's a perception that our elders are favoring this perspective rather than that one. And I think it's helpful to say publicly, no, don't misunderstand. We're doing what we're doing out of a prudential judgment and based on obedience to the command of Christ. But we do understand, we do recognize this, and we do want to communicate honor to those varying positions. But it's just it's so difficult because it's also got wrapped up this year in the political stuff as well, and so it was just this mess of genuine differences in opinion, genuine differences in analysis of the wisdom, and then also kind of all these like political ramifications. So it really that was such a mess. But I don't know if that sort of gives some guidelines that I would give, but those three things are what I would focus on. Yep.
You've spoken on the pitfalls of loving the world and the things of the world.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak on, I don't know if you call it the converse, but the desire to be loved by the world. And
Yeah.
In my mind, if you tell me it's wrong, that this seems to be more of a temptation of the structure of the church, the leadership of the church, denominational leaders,
Sure.
seminary leaders, prominent preachers.
Yeah.
And specifically adopting the world's views on sexual sin,
Yeah.
intersectionality,
Yeah.
critical theory.
Yep.
Do you see that to be the main desire to be loved by the world?
I don't want to make a sweeping statement and say everyone who has erred on those issues or who has embraced some of those philosophies is. Oh, repeat it. Thank you. I keep forgetting that. Okay, so the question was, we've spoken about not loving the world, but what about not wanting to be loved by the world or seeking the world's approval? And specifically, the way in which that manifests itself perhaps in church leaders, denominational seminary leaders, others. So within the community of professing believers who embrace different views. I'm going to maybe get the list wrong, but different views on sexuality. You mentioned intersectionality as well, which is kind of a different, critical race theory thing. And was there something else you mentioned in that list? So it's a great question. So what I would want to say is this: I'm not necessarily going to assume if I see someone who has embraced some of these, what I would consider to be worldly and not biblical philosophies, I'm not going to assume that they're doing it just because they want to be liked by the world. That might be the case, but I'm going to give them the judgment of charity and say, well, maybe they're just persuaded by the arguments. Maybe they just actually think this meshes with biblical teaching. So I don't want to dismiss it out of hand when I see someone embrace those things and say, they just want people in the world to like them. But I'm not naive. I know that might be the motivating factor, but I'm just not going to assume it, because for a couple of reasons. First of all, I do want to extend charity to all. Secondly, I think that if I were to assume that from the beginning, I wouldn't. There's really no good way then to interact with it at the level of ideas. Because if I just assume you're operating in bad faith, then we can't really have a conversation. So I would remind people, when I would speak out against that, I would remind people, be careful that you're not being influenced by the world's opinion of us. That's a dead end. But then I would also want to engage the specifics and engage those specifics biblically. So the Bible does have particular teaching about sexuality that needs to be affirmed and that is very much at odds with the teaching of the world. The Bible does have clear teaching about the nature of man and about the way in which we're supposed to interact with one another as image bearers of God. And much of what takes place under the umbrella of critical theory it diametrically opposes that teaching. So that's where I'd want to go. But you might be right, but you understand what I'm saying? I also want to be charitable in that respect. Yes?
I have a question. As you were speaking, you spoke about how God deals with us differently, and He gives the blessing and then the command.
Yep.
And I was wondering, in your view, does that affect the way we as Christians do missions in the world? Should it affect the way we do missions? And should it affect the way we parent our children?
So the question was, we talked about blessing preceding command and that's how God operates, contrary to idols. It's not transactional. And so the question was, should that affect how we view missions, and should that affect how we do engage in parenting? Yes, but I want to define that. So I think it should affect how we do missions in that the gospel that we present needs to be that gospel. It needs to be good news of what God has done in Christ for those who come to Him in faith. That is a blessing, period. That's not clean up your life. So we need to have missionaries, and indeed in our own evangelism, we need to be presenting that gospel. I don't know if that's what you mean or if you mean something else, like we should be doing good works before we present the gospel or something like that. Is that what you meant?
I'm not 100% sure. Like, I know the gospel has to go forth, and the gospel is the same for us as anybody else.
Yes.
So I understand that. I think maybe even in the way that we deal with people, I know sometimes you go on the mission field and you've got a limited amount of supply of, let's say, diaconal goods or whatever.
Yeah.
So you're waiting to see what they do before you respond. Like, almost of it.
Yeah, so the question is about, diaconal support on the mission field, and you sort of wait to see. I don't consider that an undermining of what I've described, because in those cases, for the most part, there may be particular circumstances here, but for the most part, to me, that seems like simply a wise use of the resources that have been given to serve other brothers. Paul doesn't, the Apostle Paul takes up an offering for certain churches. He doesn't take up an offering for everybody. It's just, that's how diaconal work operates. And so I think there's wisdom that needs to govern that. If somehow you were saying, or not you, but if one were saying, listen, you have to handle these goods correctly, and then God will be pleased. Then what you've done then is you've transformed the gospel in ways that are unrecognizable. Or if you've assumed that the gospel in itself is this kind of command to clean up your life. And so I want to see how you do that but again, those to me are distortions of the gospel. I don't necessarily think applying diaconal funds or diaconal support to those who are genuine believers in fact, I think that's biblical, actually. There may be occasions where you do it indiscriminately, but I don't think it's wrong to have that. With parenting, I think in one sense, of course, your blessing always does precede your command, because you have these children whom you're bringing up and feeding and clothing and putting under your roof. And so you haven't done that just for the ones who just for the good ones. You kind of have done that indiscriminately as well and blessed them. Obviously, when they reach adulthood, there may be ways in which you manage that differently. But in general, parenting is actually a pretty good example of what I'm talking about. For the most part, we know there are terrible home situations and terrible sinful parenting environments. But for the most part, I think it's actually a pretty good example because you do bless them, you do raise them. But where I think it's really relevant to parenting is to make sure that reality of how God operates is made clear. There are an unfortunately high number of children raised in Christian homes who have this understanding of the Christian faith, which is, I need to do certain things that my parents have told me to do, and that's what determines my right standing with God. And so it's not that you haven't done that. You've blessed them, and that's preceding command. But I do think we often don't teach that well because of our own perhaps insufficient understanding of the dynamics of the gospel. And so look, it is a besetting sin of Christian households. We can raise our children in a kind of implied legalism. And I don't mean by that any baggage that you might have with specific rules or regulations. I just mean that they think being good is what makes me a Christian and what makes God happy with me, because it makes my parents happy with me, and on and on up the line it goes. And I think that's something we have to be really careful of, and we have to press against that at every turn. So that in that sense, I do think we have to be very much on guard, although, I think we're modeling something that is gracious and good news for them. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
You mentioned Paul saying at one time he was the chief of sinners.
Yeah.
And I guess what league is he in that he's saying he's the chief
Right.
of sinners? I don't get it.
Well, I'm with you.
And I'm not sure I understand. He tells us so many great things, and he's so detailed. And then he says that, which seems to me to be kind of a clear exaggeration.
Well, I think that there are a couple of things going on. I think when the Apostle Paul looks at it, it's like, now some of it is he's talking about the fact that God saved him as someone who had no merit of his own to stand on. So he's highlighting the graciousness of his salvation. But I think too, again, it does illustrate something of the way in which closeness to God affects people, and this is a good thing, because you realize, man, I just have so many ways in which the Lord is continually exposing to me my own need for growth and my own sinfulness, and then when I look back on my life as a whole, I'm overwhelmed, and I really hope this is not an exaggeration for each of you if you're a Christian. I'm sort of just overwhelmed by the sinfulness of my thinking and my decisions and my behavior and my actions. And I think that overwhelmed feeling probably increases the more I understand the reality of the holiness of God. So I don't think Paul was playing games or false humility or anything like that. I think he was just genuinely struck by the gracious nature of God's dealing with him, and throughout his whole life. So what to me is so striking about it is, Paul was imprisoned for the Lord. He had been used by God to plant all these churches. He's writing to Timothy. He's fought the good fight, finished the race, kept the faith, which he says in that same letter. Okay? But at the same time, he doesn't look back on his life and say, this is a real monument to me. This is a real monument to my efforts, and boy, everybody should clean up their life like I clean up mine. He just says, this is all of grace. St. Augustine has this wonderful image of us, and he says, when we receive crowns from the Lord, we will have to cast them down at His feet, because all they are is monuments or trophies of His grace. So you're getting the reward, but who are we kidding? It's all His grace. And that's what I think Paul's communicating in that text.
I think we'll stop there. If you have more questions, please do keep those in mind.